a billionaire real estate developer, offered $500,000 for just one evening with a Vancouver bookshop owner who had nothing, and when she finally told him who she really was, he couldn't find a single word to say. Before we get into the story, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? We love hearing from you. Enjoy the story, everyone. Damien Ashford had never walked into a room and not owned it. He was 42 years old, founder and CEO of Ashford Capital Group, one of Western Canada's most aggressive property development firms. His name was on glass towers in Vancouver, on luxury condominiums in Victoria, on a waterfront hotel project in Kelowna that had displaced a fishing community and generated exactly 4 days of controversy before the news cycle moved on. He wore his reputation the way other men wore expensive watches, not to tell the time, but to remind everyone else of it. He had one assistant, Sasha, who anticipated his schedule before he asked. He had a penthouse in Yaletown with a view of False Creek that other real estate agents used in their own listings without his permission. He had never, in 42 years, been told no and meant it. And then he walked into the Meridian. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October. The rain had been doing what Vancouver rain does, not dramatic, just relentless, soaking through good coats and ruining the idea of good hair. Damien was on Commercial Drive because his acquisitions team had flagged a property at the corner of Venables and Commercial, a 2-story heritage building with an independent bookshop on the ground floor and a vacant apartment above. The owner of record was listed as Sato W. The assessed value was $1.4 million. The market value given the land was closer to $4 million. He'd been told the current tenant was unaware that the building had been quietly purchased 6 months ago by an Ashford Capital subsidiary. The plan was straightforward. Give her notice, complete renovations, convert the space. Clean, efficient, profitable. He told Sasha he'd swing by in person. Site visits were for junior staff, usually, but it had been a long week of video calls and he wanted the air, even if the air was wet. The bell above the door made a soft sound when he pushed it open. The shop was smaller than the floor plan had suggested, and somehow larger once you were inside it. Books covered every wall from floor to ceiling, arranged not alphabetically but, he would only figure this out later, by the feeling they gave you. A hand-painted sign near the door read, "Organized by mood, not by alphabet. Ask if you can't find what you need." There was a wood stove in the corner and a ginger cat asleep on a chair beside it. 2 mismatched armchairs near the window, both occupied by people reading. The whole place smelled like cedar and something warm that might have been cardamom. Behind the counter, a young woman was wrapping a book in tissue paper for a customer, speaking quietly. She had dark eyes and a calm that seemed to be an architectural feature of her face, rather than a mood. She wore a gray sweater with a small paint stain near the cuff. She did not look up when Damien walked in. He waited. When the customer left, she finally glanced at him. "Hi, looking for anything specific?" "The owner," he said, "Willa Sato." "That's me." No change in expression. "What can I help you with?" He'd expected someone older. He'd expected someone who looked like she needed the money. This woman looked like she was exactly where she'd chosen to be. He introduced himself. He watched her face for the flicker of recognition that his name usually produced. There was none. "I represent the ownership group that holds title to this building," he said. "I wanted to introduce myself personally and discuss the path forward." Willa folded her hands on the counter. "There's no path forward to discuss. I have a lease with 36 months remaining and a right of first refusal clause my grandfather negotiated in 1998. I've already spoken with a lawyer." She said this the way people give you their coffee order. No anger, no fear, just fact. "The clause is being reviewed," he said. "It's been reviewed. It holds." She offered him a small, polite smile. "Was there anything else?" He left without saying goodbye, which was not something he normally did. He came back 2 days later. Not for any reason he would have admitted to. He told himself he needed to assess the property more carefully. He told Sasha he was doing due diligence. He walked in, bought a novel he had no intention of reading, and found an excuse to ask Willa about the neighborhood. She answered directly, without flattery, and went back to reshelving a cart of returns. He stayed 40 minutes. He bought 2 more books. The week after that, he came 3 times. On his fourth visit, she looked up from the book she was pricing and said, without preamble, "You don't actually read, do you?" "Excuse me? You've bought 11 books in 8 days and you haven't cracked the spine on a single one. The paperback you bought on Tuesday is still in the Ashford Capital bag. I can see it when you set it on the counter." He stared at her. "You notice a lot." "Bookshops are quiet," she said. "You notice things in quiet." He didn't leave for another hour. Somewhere in the third week, he stopped thinking about the building. He asked her to dinner. She said she had plans. He asked again the following Wednesday. She said she appreciated it, but no. He sent a bottle of Bordeaux to the shop. She had it waiting on the counter when he came in next, the card still sealed. "I'm not sure what you're looking for," she said, handing it back to him, "but I don't think it's actually wine." He hadn't had someone say something that perceptive to him, since he genuinely couldn't remember when. He went further than he meant to. He said, directly and plainly, that he wanted to spend time with her outside of the shop, that he was prepared to compensate her for her time if it made it easier to say yes, that he was prepared to be generous. The word compensate came out before he'd properly thought it through. Willa looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Mr. Ashford, I'm a person, not a consultant." He drove home in silence and sat in his Yaletown penthouse for 2 hours without turning on a single light. He came back the next morning. "I handled that badly," he said, standing in the doorway. "You did," she agreed. "I'm sorry." She studied him for a moment. The cat on the chair opened one eye, assessed him, and closed it again. "Apology accepted," she said finally. "Do you want coffee? I make it in the back." He sat at the small table near the stove, with a mug of coffee that was better than anything from his corporate accounts at 3 of Vancouver's finest restaurants. And they talked, really talked, about the neighborhood and what the city was becoming, and whether anything worth keeping was worth fighting for. At some point he asked how long she'd run the shop. 3 years, she said. "It was my grandfather Kenji's for 41 years before that." "What happened to him?" She was quiet for a beat. "He died. Heart failure, officially." She looked at the bookshelves. "I think the more honest answer is that he spent the last 5 years of his life fighting people who wanted to erase this neighborhood, and it wore him down." She said it without accusation, just plainly, the way she said everything. Damien looked at his coffee and said nothing. He found out about the video when Sasha texted him at 6 in the morning. "You need to see this." 2 days before, a woman browsing in the poetry section had filmed a 90-second clip on her phone. In it, Damien could be seen leaning on the counter, speaking in a voice that was lower and tighter than he'd realized in the moment, and Willa could be seen on the other side, arms folded, not backing up an inch. The audio was clear enough. Him, "I'm trying to understand what you actually want here, because the lease clause will eventually be tested in court, and you know it." Her, "I know what you'd rather. You'd rather I made this easy for you. But this building is the last thing my grandfather left that still means something, and I don't particularly care what you'd rather." Him, "I could make this financially worthwhile for you." Her, "Mr. Ashford, you have been coming in here for 3 weeks. You've bought 14 books. At some point, you should probably ask yourself whether you're trying to buy a building or something you can't actually purchase." The camera cut. Caption: "When the billionaire developer meets the woman who has apparently never heard of him." By noon, it had 60,000 views. By evening, it was circulating in community Facebook groups across Metro Vancouver. By the next morning, it had hit the CBC. The headline that stung most: Ashford Capital's CEO meets his match at Commercial Drive Bookshop. The comments below it were not kind. Finally, someone just says it to his face. "Guy has never heard the word no, and it shows." "She's right, he's been in there for weeks." Sounds obsessed. "The lease clause is watertight, I'd know. I'm a property lawyer." "Is the bookshop taking donations?" "Just gave $50. Damien read all of it. His father, Clifton Ashford, called at 9 that morning. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. It ended with Clifton saying, "Sort this out quietly, Damien. This is not what this family does in public." Damien hung up and immediately had Sasha pull everything she could find on Willa Sato. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments. Would you have said what Willa said, or would you have stayed quiet? Type the word November if you've made it this far. Only the real ones watching will know what it means, and we'll get right back to the story. The file Sasha compiled was 3 pages long. Willa Sato, 27 years old, born in Vancouver. Mother Nakamura Sato, a retired teacher living in Nanaimo. Father Thomas Sato. The file noted his name, and then noted that he had died 11 years ago. Damien read the father's entry twice. Thomas Sato had been a Bay Street corporate lawyer who'd moved back to Vancouver in his late 30s. He'd worked for Halverson & Gray, a mid-sized firm, until he'd left abruptly in 2009. He'd never practiced law again. The reason for his departure was listed as personal. Something about that gap felt familiar in a way Damien couldn't immediately name. He called Todd Carver, his CFO, who had been with Ashford Capital since the early years. "The Sato building on Commercial," he said. "What do you know about the family?" Todd was quiet for a moment longer than he should have been. "Todd, there's a reason the acquisition went through a subsidiary," Todd said finally. "The Sato name has some history with the firm. From a long time ago. I didn't think it would be relevant." "What history?" Another pause. "The father Thomas. He was outside counsel on the Fernwood project." The Fernwood project. Damien set his phone on the desk and pressed 2 fingers against his mouth. The Fernwood project was a 2008 rezoning deal, one of Ashford Capital's earliest and most profitable. 43 acres in the Fraser Valley, rezoned from agricultural to mixed residential, generating a return of 800% over 4 years. It had launched the firm into a different category entirely. It had also displaced 7 farming families who'd held their leases for generations. 3 of them had launched a complaint with the Provincial Land Tribunal. The complaint had been reviewed and dismissed. Thomas Sato had been the lawyer advising those families. He'd left Halverson & Gray 6 months after the dismissal. He'd died 2 years later. His daughter had been 15 years old. Damien sat at his desk for a very long time. He went to the Meridian that afternoon without calling ahead. The shop was quiet. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Yamamoto, who came in every Tuesday and Thursday to help with inventory, was somewhere in the back. Willa was at the counter. She looked at him when he came in. She did not look surprised. "You found out," she said. He stopped walking. "You knew I would." Eventually. She came out from behind the counter and flipped the sign on the door to closed. Mrs. Yamamoto appeared briefly from the back room, took one look at Damien, and disappeared again. "Your father represented the Fernwood families," Damien said. "Yes." "He left his firm after the dismissal." "Yes." "He died 2 years later." Willa's voice, for the first time since he'd known her, was careful rather than calm. "He died of a stroke. He was 44 years old. He'd spent 2 years working pro bono on appeals that kept getting knocked back. He didn't sleep. He stopped eating right." She stopped, looked at the bookshelves. The official cause was a stroke. The silence in the shop was different from its usual silence. "I didn't know," Damien said, "about him. I was 24 in 2008. I was finishing my MBA. The Fernwood deal was my father's project." "I know," she said. "I've known since the second time you came into this shop." He stared at her. "Then why?" "Because I wanted to see who you actually were." She turned to face him fully. "Your company tried to buy this building through a subsidiary, which means someone knew about my father, and thought hiding your name would make it cleaner. I could have called a journalist the day I figured that out. I still have my father's files, Damien, everything. All the correspondence, all the documentation on the Fernwood deal, including things that never made it to the tribunal." She said his first name like it was simply accurate, not a weapon, just a fact. "Why didn't you?" he said. "Because destroying your company doesn't give me back my father." She looked at him steadily. "And because I wasn't sure yet whether you were someone worth being honest with." "And now?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had started again. "You've been coming into this shop for 3 weeks, she said. "You bought 14 books. You sat in that chair and talked to me about whether any city is worth saving. You told me about your mother, who died when you were 19, and how she used to make your father slow down. You apologized to me for something most men in your position would never have thought to apologize for." She folded her arms. "I think you might be someone worth being honest with." I'm not entirely certain yet. What would make you certain? He asked. Tell me the truth about what you're going to do with this building, she said. Not the legal answer, the real one. The answer he'd been prepared to give, about the acquisition, the permits, the projected returns, felt very far away. I don't know anymore, he said, and that was the truth. 2 days later, Todd Carver came to the Meridian without being asked. Damien found out afterward, from Mrs. Yamamoto, who had stayed in the back and listened through the curtain. Todd had walked in with a folder. He'd told Willa that the lease clause, whatever her lawyer said, had vulnerabilities that a sufficiently motivated legal team could exploit. He'd told her that archived documents rarely held up to modern discovery. He'd told her politely, in the measured voice of someone who had delivered this kind of message before, that the sensible thing would be to accept a settlement and move on. She'd handed the folder back to him without opening it. She'd told him she appreciated the visit. Then she'd called Damien. Your CFO came to see me, she said. He was in a board meeting. He stepped out immediately. When she finished telling him what Todd had said, there was a long pause on the line. He had no authorization to do that, Damien said. None. I know, she said. I'm telling you because I think you should know what's happening in your own company. He ended the call and walked back into the boardroom. He looked at Todd across the table. Todd looked back with the calm of a man who believed he'd done the right thing. Clear the room, Damien said. That evening, Clifton Ashford called again. He was 70 years old and still arrived at the office 3 days a week. He had opinions about loyalty and about what a family's name was worth and about decisions made without sufficient consultation. He told Damien that the Sato situation needed to be resolved. That documentation from 15 years ago was a distraction. That the property was worth acquiring and the tenant was. He paused here, choosing words, not the point. She's not the point, Damien said. Exactly. I meant that as a question. Damien was standing at the window of his penthouse, looking at the lights on the water. She's a 27-year-old woman running a bookshop her grandfather built. Her father spent the last 2 years of his life working on a case against our company. He was 44 when he died. Clifton Ashford said nothing. I need to know what really happened with the Fernwood families, Damien said. Not the board version, the version Thomas Sato had. That is a conversation for lawyers. I'm asking you directly. The silence stretched. Then Clifton said, the families were compensated fairly within the framework. Dad. Damien's voice stayed level. I've read the letters she has. I know what was in the tribunal submissions. I know what the framework covered and what it didn't. Tell me the truth. Another long silence. When Clifton finally spoke, his voice was older, not broken, but tired in a way Damien hadn't heard before. We followed the law, he said. Following the law isn't the same as doing what's right. Damien stepped back from the window. I'm going to meet with Willa Sato. I'm going to ask her what she needs, and whatever she says, I'm going to take it to the board. Clifton Ashford breathed in slowly. And if the board disagrees? Then I'll have a very different kind of conversation with the board. He paused. The Fernwood families, Dad. Are any of them still reachable? A long silence. Then, I'll ask someone to pull the records. Not an apology, not a concession. Just for the first time in the conversation, a door left slightly open. He went to the Meridian, the next morning before it opened, and sat on the front step with 2 coffees from the place on the corner, because he'd watched her walk there every morning for 2 weeks, and he knew she ordered a flat white. When she turned the corner and saw him on her front step in the rain with 2 cups, she stopped walking. That's my coffee, she said. I think so. She came and sat beside him on the step and took the cup. They sat in the October rain like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He told her about his conversation with Clifton. He told her about the board meeting he'd scheduled for Thursday. He told her that he wanted to see her father's files. Not to bury them, but because the company needed to know what it had actually done and what it still could do. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, holding her coffee with both hands. My grandfather used to say, she said slowly, that the test of a person isn't how they act when everything is going well. It's what they do the first time they're asked to do something hard when they don't have to. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Damien said. He was the best person I've ever known. She looked at the drive waking up around them, the flower shop pulling out its sidewalk display, the bakery with its lights on, the fruit stand beginning to set up its crates. He would have found you genuinely interesting, I think. He always said the most dangerous thing in real estate wasn't the bad developers. It was the good ones who never stopped to ask the question. What question? She turned and looked at him directly. Who does this cost? He held her gaze. I'm asking. She nodded slowly. I know you are. The board meeting happened. It was long and uncomfortable, and 3 of the 7 board members threatened to resign, and none of them actually did. The Fernwood documentation, Willa's father's files, formally, was submitted to an independent mediator along with Ashford Capital's own archives. Todd Carver resigned the day after the board meeting without being asked to, which told Damien something useful about what Todd had known and when he'd known it. The mediator's process took 4 months. At the end of it, Ashford Capital made a settlement offer to the surviving Fernwood leaseholders. 2 of the 7 had died since 2009. 3 were in their 70s and still farming other land. 1 had moved her family to Alberta. 1 was a man named Gerald Hennessy who was 68 years old and had a son who had grown up watching his father lose the land they'd worked for 3 generations. Damien met Gerald in person. He did not send lawyers. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Gerald spoke plainly about what the loss had meant. He did not raise his voice. When Damien thanked him for coming, Gerald said, "I don't need thanks. I need someone to make sure it doesn't happen to the next family." Damien went home that night and didn't sleep much. In the morning, he called Willa. What Gerald said, he told her, about the next family. Yes, she said. I want to set up something. A land trust, a community oversight board. Whatever the right structure is. People who can actually review rezoning impacts before they go through, not after. He paused. I don't know how to build this properly. I need someone who understands both sides of it. Someone who grew up watching it from the community side and knows the legal landscape. She was quiet for a moment. My mother, she said, was a teacher for 30 years and ran the neighborhood land advisory for most of them. She retired last year. She'd never forgive me if I didn't mention her. Is she willing to meet? I'll ask her. A pause. She's going to cry and then say yes. Tell her I'm sorry for everything she and your father went through, he said. Tell her yourself, Willa said. She'll appreciate it more from you. The Meridian received a new lease, a 40-year term, negotiated by a property lawyer who donated her work because she'd grown up on Commercial Drive and recognized the shop from her childhood. The building was taken off Ashford Capital's acquisition list permanently. Clifton Ashford attended the signing. He sat across the table from Willa, and when it was finished, he shook her hand and said, with some difficulty, Your father was tenacious. I don't mean that the way it would have sounded 15 years ago. Willa looked at him steadily. I know, she said. He nodded once. It was the closest thing to an apology he could manage that day, and she accepted it, because she understood that some people arrive at honesty slowly, and that slow is still arrival. On a Friday evening in March, when the shop was closed and the ginger cat was asleep in his usual chair, and the rain was doing what Vancouver rain does, Damien was sitting at the small table near the wood stove reading. Actually reading, this time, a novel he'd bought 4 months ago and never opened. Willa came and sat across from him and put her feet up on the edge of the table like she owned the place, which she did. You're at page 40, she said. I started at the beginning this time. She smiled, the real smile, not the polite one she'd used on him in the beginning. He knew the difference now. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and set a small plain box on the table between them. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. It belonged to my mother, he said. She would have. He stopped, started again. She would have wanted me to give it to someone I couldn't talk out of anything. She believed those were the only people worth giving it to. Willa leaned forward and opened the box. She looked at it for a long time, then she looked at him. Willa Sato, he said quietly, will you marry me? Outside, the city was doing what it did, growing and changing and pressing up against the things worth keeping. Inside the shop, it was warm and the cat slept on. Yes, she said, but the cat comes with me. Obviously, he said. She laughed, and he put the ring on her finger. And somewhere in Nanaimo, her mother picked up the phone a few minutes later and started crying before Willa had finished her first sentence, which was exactly what Willa had predicted and which made her laugh again. Standing in the bookshop with rain on the windows and the wood stove going, and a man who had walked in one October afternoon, looking for something he didn't have a name for, and found it. The land trust launched the following spring, with Rei Nakamura Sato as its founding chair. The first family it protected held a 30-acre farm in Langley that 3 separate developers had tried to acquire over 2 years. The farmhouse had a photograph on the wall that had been there since 1961. It stayed there. And every morning before the Meridian opened and the first customers came in with their rain-damp coats and their need for something that felt like home, Willa would unlock the door and turn the sign and put the kettle on, and sometimes Damien would already be there, sitting in the chair by the wood stove with a book he was actually reading. And the cat would be on his lap because the cat had, without fanfare or sentimentality, simply decided that this was where he lived now. Which, all things considered, was exactly how the whole thing had started. What did you think of Willa and Damien's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rate it from 0 to 10. We really do read every single one. If stories like this one are what you come here for, subscribe to Inspiring Stories and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And don't go anywhere. We have more stories waiting for you right at the end of this screen.